Facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah, you effing.
I don't think you have a right to pornography, though. I don't think there's an inherent right to pornography.
All of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet. Do you think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move? Income inequality in the United States is also quite high, right? There are people who are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and then there's the local checker at your grocery store. But if the local checker at your grocery store is getting richer, then it seems to me they have nothing particularly to complain about in how the economy is operating. They don't have a right to Jeff Bezos' money. They don't have a right to Bill Gates' money any more than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos has a right to their money.
As much as it pains me to admit this, just a decade ago, I probably would have been in Ben Shapiro's target audience. It's really to admit now, but you guys know I've always tried to be as honest and genuine about myself as possible. 19-year-old Savvy was a libertarian frat boy. Here's how a conversation with college Savvy would have gone. Oh, hello, Savvy. How's it going? Yeah, pretty good. It's going pretty good, man. Oh, yo, today I got this new button for my backpack. It said, "I heart capitalism" on it. It's really great. I'm gonna put it next to all my backpack pins of all my little rainbow ribbons and my marijuana leaves. Where the hell did you get that? Oh, so I was walking across campus and I saw some student political organization handing out buttons. And here's what's funny, though. So the guy handing it to me was like, the ironic thing is that these buttons say, "I heart capitalism," but ironically enough, they're free. And I told his stupid ass, if you were a real capitalist,
you would know that nothing is free.
Wow, that's, aggressive. Well, dude, I'm just tired of people being fake capitalists, okay? Like, if the US was really a capitalist country, why can't I smoke in restaurants? Because it's harmful to the health of those around you? Right, but like, man, can't we let the free market decide that? The free market doesn't need to decide anything in this case. This has already been decided by reality. Nah, man, the government shouldn't be telling us anything. Like, if a restaurant allows smoking and people don't like that, they just won't eat at that restaurant, right? And then if enough people don't eat at that restaurant, it will go out of business. Or people who like non-smoking restaurants can just go to those places instead. Bruh, you gotta vote with your dollar. Okay, but what about restaurant employees? You realize smoke in restaurants could cause unhealthy working conditions for the waitstaff, for the hosts. Then they don't have to work there. Vote with your dollar, bruh. I was told I'm too pale to work at Hooters. So you're okay with limiting the jobs that people can get for health reasons? You're okay with creating more unhealthy work environments for people who are just trying to provide for their families? Do you also not support the government having regulated factories so that they had safety conditions for people back in the 1920s? Yeah, fair enough, man. Wanna do shots? Yeah, sure. But do you know what firmly changed this insufferable version of me? Going to college. Back when I was in high school, I was balls deep in the myth of American meritocracy. After all, I had just gotten accepted to a great college, and I had worked my ass off. I was a teenage workaholic if you ever saw one. All of the self-help gurus have always told me that if I work my ass off, I would achieve results. This is what a conversation with high school Savvy would have gone like. Hey, how's it going, Savvy? What the fuck did you just say to me, you little bitch? Don't you know that I have 300 confirmed exams to study for? What? This is my only 15 minutes of studying time between when the school day ends and when practice for the school play starts, and I have to run the soundboard cues today, and then I have marching band practice after that, and then I have to get at school 6 a.m. tomorrow because I need to use the library for debate team research because I'm going to nationals this year, bitch! Okay, sorry, I didn't realize. And then recently I just found this book. It's by some guy named Ben Shapiro, and it's called Primetime Propaganda, and it just came out this year, which is 2011, and it's all about political bias in the media, and I need to read more of it tomorrow because I think I might be able to use it to incorporate it into my speech for the debate team nationals this year, which my speech is all about political bias in the media, and that's what the book's about. Oof, so you don't know about Ben Shapiro yet, huh? I don't know what about him. I mean, his book's okay so far. It's kind of homophobic though, and you know, I'm not really a fan of that. Well, I mean, yeah, obviously, considering what? That I'm an LGBTQ ally? Oh yeah, I forgot it's 2011. Yeah, let's go with that. What? I'm not gay. Yeah, sure, you're not gay, whatever. Would a lesbian be giving out handjobs on the band bus? I don't know. Would a straight girl beat off to Lady Gaga? What the fuck? I'm you. I know everything. Thank God this version of me changed after college. College is a place where people often go to expand their horizons and learn about the intricacies and the nuances of the world around them. We also learn the theories behind so many of the things that we observe in our world and why things work the way they do, not just scientifically, but also socially and culturally. We learn about philosophers and theorists and academics who take complex subjects and put them into even more complex and inaccessible words. But at the end of college, most of us leave with an expanded worldview. Unfortunately, because of many of the costs associated with college, and because of the cost-benefit analysis regarding whether college is even necessary for certain careers, not everyone has this privilege, which ends up creating somewhat of a class divide among Americans. And not just a financial divide. A divide in our language, a divide in our communities, and ultimately a divide in our echo chambers. And surprisingly, this is actually one of the points that Ben Shapiro gets right in his book, The Authoritarian Moment. While today's book review is going to be mostly critical, I have to admit that beneath his fast-talking high school policy debate bro exterior, in some parts, Ben Shapiro's actually onto something. Now, bear with me, Ben has a similar issue to his sister, classically Abby. I've talked about this when I've reacted to her videos before. There's a lot of points in this where I'm like, ooh, you almost had me in the first half, not gonna lie, you almost had me there, Abby, and then you flipped it around. But I've noticed that the way she flips it around is in a completely nonsensical way. Have you guys seen that SpongeBob meme where Patrick is like, yep, that sounds right, and he's like on the same page, then at the end he's like, no. That's how I feel. That's how I feel with Abby half the time. Because she'll say something, and then her conclusion makes no sense that she draws from those things. So for example, if I was like, 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Yes. 4 plus 4 equals 8, right? Yes. 8 plus 8 equals 16. Uh-huh. So therefore, the number 16 is vanilla pudding. And then you'd be like, what? And you'd be like, okay, listen, right? 2 plus 2 is 4. And it's like, no. Everything you said leading up to that point, but how did you get from 8 plus 8 is 16 to 16 equals pudding? And they're like, well, because obviously 16 equals pudding. And they're like, it doesn't make any sense, but like, we're supposed to pretend it makes sense. Ben will often start making a point, have me in the first half, and then draw wildly inaccurate conclusions that could lead to points of view that would be harmful against many groups of people, including groups that... But at the core, some of his message deep down is rooted in something real. And that's why I think there's so much to unpack in this book, and so much that we have to talk about. So let's do it! Let's dive into Ben's book, The Authoritarian Moment, 420 Reasons That Facts Actually Do Care About Your Feelings, number 69 will shock you!
Get you some nuts.
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should take up lesbianism.
Chicago.
You guys asked for it.
What's up, my fellow small business supporters? I'm Savvy, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome for the first time. I'm Savvy, this is Savvy Writes Books, this is the channel where we talk about books and business, and today we have a book review for you guys. As I've mentioned, The Authoritarian Moment by Ben Shapiro, a book review that I've been working on for quite some time now. Today's video will deal with quite a range of controversial topics, and because of that, I do sometimes worry about this video getting demonetized, which is why I'm really grateful for two things. First of all, I'm so grateful that this video has a sponsor! Today's video is sponsored by Magic Spoon, which is a high-protein, low-carb breakfast cereal with fun flavors meant to evoke the childhood nostalgia of eating some cereal while watching some Saturday morning cartoons. I really appreciate Magic Spoon sending me all this cereal to try because I've been really loving it. The frosted flavor has been a really great late-night snack for me, and I've been loving eating the cinnamon flavor for breakfast before I do the Your Morning Guru show every morning. If you guys watch that show, you probably know that on it I often complain about being really hungry in the morning or being really hungry before the show starts, and how I've been looking for a good breakfast option, and honestly, this cereal has been perfectly fulfilling that need for me. I've also this year been documenting a lot of my workout journey, especially during the new year on Your Morning Guru, and for me that has included finding more ways to get extra protein into my daily meals. So I was really excited when Magic Spoon reached out to me and let me know the content of their cereal. Magic Spoon cereals have 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net grams of carbs in each serving, along with 140 calories per serving. They're also keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb. To try Magic Spoon cereal, head to magicspoon.com/savvy or click the link in my description below and use the code SAVVY to get $5 off on any order when you're at the checkout. It's honestly been a great cereal to fuel me up before a big, exhausting book review like the one I'm about to embark on right now, so I'm glad I ate some this morning. Let's go. The second thing that I'm super grateful for is my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for helping support this channel. Patreon supporters' names are up on the screen right now and in the description below. My supporters who contribute $5 a month and up have the option to link their own store or website or social media page in my description below to promote that, so go ahead and check out their work. Some of them are artists and small business owners as well, so I'd really love it if you guys could go give them some support. Now, let's get into the review. Now, to start off, as a disclaimer, I am not a political expert. I'm a book reviewer, and because I don't have expertise in every single topic that Ben discusses in this book, I need to see if his research and his arguments can convince me. It's his job as the author to provide me with all the necessary information that I, as the reader, need to see his point. So with all of that in mind, let's move into our first major section of this video. Who is Ben Shapiro? Ben Shapiro is a former editor from Breitbart News and the current founder and host of The Daily Wire, his own show that he hosts on YouTube as well as podcasts and radio shows, where he currently on YouTube has over 2.6 million subscribers. Ben identifies as a conservative commentator, and he has become widely known for some of his catchphrases, including
Facts don't care about your feelings.
"Facts don't care about your feelings."
Facts don't care about your feelings.
And he has risen to become one of the most popular and well-known conservative commentators of the millennial generation. At the young age of 38 years old, Ben already owns his own media company with over 100 employees and has 11 books to his name. To be fair, I also have 11 books out and I'm 29. But Ben has a lot more readers than I do, so it's safe to say that Ben Shapiro is a much bigger influence on media and culture as a whole than I could ever hope to be. While in the past on this channel, we've had lots of fun memeing on Ben Shapiro for his self-admitted inability to arouse women, and how funny it is when you slow down his fast-talking debate bro voice to make him sound drunk.
Yeah, you effing wet-ass P-word. As a sympathetic human being.
That's not going to be what today's video is about at all. While dunking on Ben Shapiro can be fun, I actually want this video to have a bigger impact than that. I'm hoping that I can reach both Ben's fans and his critics and give a more complete picture of where his ideas might come from, including which ones are accurate and worthy of discussion and which ones don't tell a complete story. This is a very important frame for today's review. Ben really isn't the big brain genius that most of his fans think he is, but he's also not the complete idiot that his critics think he is either. And it's actually because Ben Shapiro is a fairly smart guy that's what makes him so dangerous in the first place. Like many of the gurus we've covered on this channel before, Ben brings his audience in with reasonable statements and facts and research. I mean, this book alone has a 33-page note section bibliography in the back, only to then use bits and pieces of that research, causing people to fall into extremism. This is all to say I do understand how and why Ben has gained the fame that he has. So if you're a Ben Shapiro fan and you're here on this video, thank you. I'm glad you chose to click on it. While this review is going to be mostly critical of his work, I do hope you'll stick around to listen to another point of view. Now let's get into a little background information about this book itself. The Authoritarian Moment was published by Broadside Books in August of 2021. Broadside Books is a division of HarperCollins, and if you've been on this channel, you know that HarperCollins is one of the big 5 publishing corporations that controls the majority of the book publishing industry. The Authoritarian Moment currently has a 5-star average on Amazon with over 2,800 reviews, which most authors can probably agree that's pretty unheard of. Here are some examples of such reviews I found on Amazon. And by the way, in case you think I'm cherry-picking these reviews, know that this book has a 94% 5-star rating out of nearly 3,000 reviews. This review says, actually full of facts, unlike books written by left-leaning authors. Informative perspective that can be easily understood and verified as factual, unlike and of the biased news stations. Another review says, Ben tells the truth. Half of the country refuses to believe the truth and preach hate and lies. Ben is one of the good guys. This review says, whether you agree with his opinions or not, you can't deny that he's right. Facts don't care about your feelings. We'll talk about that in just a moment. This review says, Shapiro always infuses intellect with the obvious common sense conclusions. You can only miss if you are cemented in ideological muck. You can try and argue his points, but only if you enjoy looking foolish. This is a sharp mind's read. Well then I guess I enjoy looking foolish because I'm gonna try. Make me look foolish, Daddy.
Let's say you've been a bad girl. Then I believe you'd agree with me when I say that you deserve a spanking. Am I not correct? A bad girl deserves a spanking. And as I am daddy, you are my girl, so I am the one who must provide punishment.
Now that we have a rough idea of this book's creation and its overall audience reception, let's delve into its content. A good place to start when looking at a book's content, particularly a nonfiction book, is to look at the thesis or the overall argument that it's trying to make. On page 32, Ben gives what I would see as one of the theses of this book. He says, "The authoritarian left has successfully pursued a three-step strategy to effectuate their takeover of the major institutions in our society. The first step, winning the emotional argument. The second step, renormalizing the institutions. The third step, locking all the doors." Here, Ben clearly sets up that using emotional arguments is a manipulation tactic that leftists use when creating what he will later refer to as cultural authoritarianism, and we'll get to what he means by that in a moment. Criticizing emotional arguments is part of Ben's overall claim to fame. His most famous clip probably being,
Facts don't care about your feelings.
Ben is basically the type of guy that frat boys in the early 2010s would cite when they used the memes like, "Feels before reals, am I right? Remember those days? Remember Call Me Maybe? What a time." But is there truth to what Ben is saying? Do facts care about our feelings? Well, I already discussed this in my review of Dave Rubin's book, Don't Burn This Book, but here's a brief refresher. Do facts care about our feelings? Well, as facts aren't sentient, no, they don't literally care about our feelings. In a purely literal sense, Ben Shapiro is right. Facts don't care about our feelings the same way that cheese doesn't care about our feelings, the same way that doorknobs don't care about our feelings. But while facts do attempt to present an objective reality, the reality of human interaction, facts are always contextual. So here's an objective fact. 2 + 2 = 4. If I was teaching your child math and I told them 2 + 2 = 4, I would be presenting them with a fact. And the context for that fact would be that I want your kid to learn how math works. If I pass someone on the street at night and they're currently dying of a stab wound, bleeding out all over the sidewalk and begging me to call an ambulance, and I walk up to them and say 2 + 2 = 4 and walk away, is that still a fact? Yeah, of course, the situation doesn't make the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 false in any way. But why would I ever say it in that context? The only potential conclusion you could draw from that situation is that I'm deciding not to help someone who's dying. Am I wrong that 2 + 2 = 4? No, I'm right, but in that particular situation, that fact doesn't matter at all. While a fact may be universally true, a fact alone does not tell a story. Much of the complete story lies in why someone is stating that fact in the first place. This is why I get really annoyed when any one group or ideology or side of an issue says, "Well, our side's the one that cares about the facts." Yeah, congratulations, you're very smart. And your opponents say the exact same thing about their side. This is all to say, because Ben is so fixated on using facts alone, we'll have to examine when his book uses emotional arguments without having sufficient facts to back them up. If Ben is going to try convincing me that cancel culture is the true authoritarianism, I'm gonna need to see enough evidence that this isn't based on his use of pathos by appealing to fear. Next, let's talk about the title of the book, The Authoritarian Moment. On page 49, Ben discusses how the meaning of being a leftist has changed over time, and how cyclical the nature is of the US's mainstream acceptance of wealth redistribution, government intervention, versus free market ideas. In this context, moment refers to a moment. So overall, I found this title interesting. The Authoritarian Moment is a look at how Ben's interpretation of cultural authoritarianism plays out in today's world within the context of how it came to be historically in the first place, and how it's changed. It's just a moment within a cycle. It will pass, and it will come again. Another important piece of Ben's overall argument in this book is free speech absolutism. Throughout this book, Ben touts the ideal of freedom, meaning individualism, as the ultimate goal for the US, and assumes the premise that all of his readers agree that freedom is a value all of us share. Now, I don't disagree at all here. I think constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of the press is part of what makes the fabric of the US what it is. But while constitutional constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech suggests a specific guideline, the abstract concept of freedom actually suggests a paradox. This paradox first becomes relevant on pages 35 to 36. Ben says, "The left has posited that even minor offense amounts to profound damage, hence the language of microaggressions which posit by their very nature that verbiage is an act of violence. Microaggressions require no intent. Intent is not an element of the crime." The main issue here is that Ben doesn't define what he means by crime. Because he provides no sources of anyone getting in legal trouble for verbal microaggressions, I have to assume that he means the word crime colloquially, and not in a legal sense. Which, whether or not Ben personally likes it, still falls in line with free speech. Ben has the freedom legally to be a dick, and I have the freedom legally to call him a dick. That's not authoritarianism, that's both of us exercising our legal guaranteed freedom of speech but coming to an impasse. Ben's argument here rather seems to be that viewing verbal microaggressions as an act of violence, while it may not constitute a legal crime, it has caused him to feel culturally stifled in his speech. And not just him, but many of his followers and his fans as well. And that's frustrating to feel, Ben, I know. If I'd been alive 60 years ago, I'd also feel culturally stifled in my ability to freely talk about how fucking gay I am. The issue here is that there really is no such thing as absolute freedom. The ideal Ben is striving for technically cannot exist. Every freedom inherently comes with the negation of another. To guarantee freedom of speech, we can't guarantee freedom from harm. But if we do want to guarantee freedom from harm, physical or emotional, freedom of speech as it is cannot exist. According to Psychology Today, emotional pain and physical pain actually have been found to target similar parts of the brain and cause people to feel pain in similar ways. We all know it's illegal to punch someone because we want to keep that person free from physical harm. That person has a right to exist without physical harm. But freedom from emotional harm would necessitate the erosion of freedom of speech, and this is where we enter the paradox of individualism. On pages 34 to 35, Ben describes what he defines as the cordiality principle. He says, "The left suggested that judgment itself was wrong, uncivilized, vulgar. Judgment was, of course, judgmental, and this was bad. To be judgmental was to offend someone and thus to violate the cordiality principle. Many conservatives became uncomfortable standing up for their own principles in polite company, or in moral terms, better not to be perceived as not very nice. Now, traditionally, offense has not been considered a serious harm. J.S. Mill famously posited the so-called harm principle, the notion that activity that actually harms someone ought to be condemned, or even legally barred. The distinction between harm and offense, however, can be murky. Feinberg posited a balancing test. On one hand, society would balance the seriousness of an offense. On the other hand, society would balance the reasonableness of the offending conduct. But here's the issue with this. This alone doesn't fit into facts not caring about our feelings. Whether an action can be categorized as harmful or not harmful doesn't exist in the realm of objective truth. It exists only within the realm of subjective human perception. For example, we know it's not legal to kill other people because if we were to kill someone else, that would violate that person's right to life. As I said, we don't punch people because punching people violates that person's right to not experience physical harm. But where does speech come into play? Where is the line of what harm means? On page 35, Ben continues, Feinberg points out, "Few of us believe that people should publicly have sex with one another. That's a crime against our sense of cordiality." But this right here indicates the paradox. When do cordiality or decency come into play? We have a right to cordiality and decency according to Feinberg, whose point Ben supports in this book. If we have the right to not see people banging in the streets, why don't we also have the right not to be hurt by someone's words? And just to be clear real quick, I am a defender of free speech. I'm asking these questions rhetorically. I will defend freedom of speech as an American right until the end of time. All I'm doing, though, is pointing out that there is truly no logical or fact-based way that we can determine what is harm and what is freedom. All of it is subjective. That's to say, maybe to an extent, facts have to care about our feelings. So what is true individualism? How can we balance the rights to individual freedom without infringing on others? And where is the line of where that infringement occurs? But Ben, as the author of this book, never tells me. Now, as I've said, all of these concepts only exist within our understanding of them. What I see as true freedom, someone else may see as inadequate. What I see as conservative, someone may see as a centrist, or what I see as a neoliberal, Ben may see as a hard leftist. So before we fully review each idea that Ben espouses, let's first look at how Ben defines each of his terms, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language. Because the concept of authoritarianism drives many of this book's arguments, let's start by looking at how Ben defines the word authoritarian. On page 20, Ben says, "Free speech and free exchange of ideas die when the attitude of philosophical tolerance withers. Government authoritarianism isn't the only way to kill American freedom. Cultural authoritarianism works too. It has always worked." So what authoritarianism? In its most simplistic form, what Ben is talking about here is basically cancel culture. And not in like the meme, oh guys, PewDiePie got canceled for the 12th time this year kind of way. I'm talking about actual cancel culture with real effects. He's talking about the cancel culture that costs people their jobs, their livelihoods, that ostracizes everyday, hardworking people from their families, their communities, and their circles. On page 21, Ben says the following of cultural authoritarianism. "There is no respite. Your employer requires your fealty to woke principles. Corporations require that you mirror their political priorities. The media treat you as a crude barbarian. There are no distractions. Hollywood mocks your morals and damns you for adherence to them. The sports world requires that you mimic the popular perversities of the moment before being allowed to escape. Social media controls the flow of information you can see while preventing you from speaking your mind. And each day you wonder if today will be the day the mob comes for you." Now, while Ben is planning to expand on each of these points and provide examples in later chapters, I do have to point out that his argumentation style in that paragraph is purely pathos. He's appealing to fear, and while I agree that feelings do have a place in this discussion, Ben's emotionally driven argumentation style often indicates a hypocrisy to his paradigm that facts and feelings exist as completely separate concepts. Throughout his initial descriptions of 21st century leftist authoritarianism, Ben is careful to define it culturally rather than by government mandate. This is because Ben is a strong believer in the free market and in capitalism. And a lot of the issues Ben brings up are the result of the free market working without government intervention. Of course, your employee can fire you because you didn't let a trans woman go into the bathroom. Your employer can fire you for any reason at all. And Ben doesn't want to argue otherwise because that would restrict businesses' freedoms in his ideal world of separating business from state. That's why he gives this caveat on page 21. After all, that's the free market just working. Why are you whining about social media censorship or about social ostracism? People have a right to tear you to shreds, to end your career, to malign your character. It's all free speech. While Ben characterizes his hypothetical opponent here somewhat sarcastically, in a fear-mongering tone, he also admits to agreeing with this notion on the surface. With one, none of that violation of the First Amendment. It simply amounts to the end of the Republic. The idea being that from here, Ben will now detail how these cultural practices will supposedly cause the US as a republic to collapse. We'll get there in a few moments, but first I want to finish addressing whether this is truly authoritarianism or not. After examining the concept of cultural authoritarianism, I think Ben's mischaracterized. I wouldn't call this phenomenon authoritarianism. What I would call it is purity culture. Purity culture has deep roots in motivating human self-worth. And just because you aren't evangelical or even religious at all doesn't mean that you aren't subject to purity culture's influence. Usually, purity culture refers to religious communities' judgment of any perceived slight, and this is often sexual. You have sex before marriage, you're impure. You allow someone other than your spouse to see you naked, you're impure. You look at porn, you're impure. Any small infraction leads those around you viewing you as dirty or tainted in some way, and this has devastating effects on mental health, body image, and more. But even outside of church influences, I think purity culture motivates a lot of the ways that humans operate. Look at diet culture, for example. Diet culture says that denial and restriction make you more virtuous and trustworthy, and that gluttony makes you an untrustworthy and deceitful person.
Hey Pam, I thought you were doing Whole30.
But even in a political sense, leftists can fall prey to purity culture as well, and that's where I believe cancel culture actually comes into play. I personally believe that progressivism is necessary for moving toward a country of more equal opportunity for all, but I often see purity culture springing up around progressivism as well. We see this happen when someone digs up a bad tweet someone had 10 years ago and assumes that all of that person's activist efforts must now be null because they didn't always hold these views. They are impure because of past actions. And this is one of the reasons that I've actually spoken out against cancel culture on my channel and gone against my typical circle's narrative that cancel culture is exclusively about accountability. Because, like religious purity culture, cancel culture doesn't allow room for mistakes. We all hurt people sometimes, and while we should strive to be kind to others and to make the world better, we will make mistakes. Encouraging people to follow what you deem as a virtuous life shouldn't include excommunication for one infraction, especially if you can show growth. And that's all to say that I think labeling the things Ben is about to discuss in this book as authoritarianism is wildly dramatic and inaccurate. If we frame it in this context culture instead, we may see that Ben's actually onto something in a few places. Of course, though, like he does, Ben often has me in the first half and then completely ruins it with his purported conclusions. So we know that this book deals a lot with the left and leftists, but what is the left? I personally think right and left, even politically, are relative depending on where you define the center, but for the sake of reviewing this book, let's look at Ben's definition of leftist. On page 40, he says, American politics is, broadly speaking, divided into three significant groups: conservatives, leftists, and liberals. Liberals may share redistributionist goals with leftists, but can be distinguished from leftists with a simple test, asking whether those who disagree ought to be silenced. Where did he get this definition? The book shows no little superscript number to link to a source. There is no definition sourced in any of the 33 pages of notes in the back, and I also do need to point out that I really don't agree with Ben's definition here. I'm sorry to be a goober who cites the dictionary again, but according to the dictionary, liberals are left-leaning but often agree with some level of a capitalist system with small amounts of government intervention to ensure, and also support taxes for social programs, but leftists support higher taxes on the wealthy and wealth redistribution. Wanting to silence people is not usually a part of the discussion. The distinction many draw is about economic policy. On page 41, Ben continues, liberals are left with a choice of their own. They can either choose to form a coalition with leftists, with whom they agree on most policy goals, but with whom they disagree on fundamental freedom principles. Or they can form a coalition with conservatives, with whom they disagree on policy goals, but with whom they agree on fundamental freedom principles. You guys see what Ben did there? It's something called the snuck premise. When we were following Ben Shapiro on Your Morning Guru, we reacted to a video by Charisma on Command, which broke down Ben's argumentation style, including the way he sneaks premises into his arguments to essentially beg the question.
One of the big ways that I see him stump his opponents is through the use of snuck premises. Essentially, you introduce the exact point of contention as a given, and that's through the clever use of language. Now, this isn't to pick on Ben because we all do this from time to time.
So, in the sentence that I read, did you catch the snuck premise? They can form a coalition with conservatives with whom they disagree on policy goals, but with whom they agree on fundamental freedom principles. Ben sneaks in the premise that conservatives believe in freedom, while leftists don't. Ben never defines the specific pieces of freedom that this means. Is this about the freedom to get to call someone a slur if you want, or the freedom to kiss your same-gender partner in public? Are we talking about the freedom for a corporation to deny healthcare, or the freedom for an individual to undergo gender transition surgeries and treatment? All of these are freedoms, some of which Ben agrees with, and others of which he doesn't. And is he even talking about freedom here on a government level, or is this still a piece of cultural freedom, whatever that supposedly means? Overall, this is dangerously similar to the logical fallacy of begging the question, which is when an argument treats a premise as proven before the proof happens. In this argument, Ben is treating it as a given that conservatives are the ones who believe in this abstract concept of freedom, and that leftists don't. Now, it would be hard to continue discussing who conservatives are and what they believe unless we have a definition from Ben himself about what conservative means. On page 33, Ben first cites philosopher Russell Kirk's definition. Conservatives believe in peace and stability, in human imperfectibility, and in community. And then he follows it up with his own definition. Conservatism relies on moral judgment. Conservatism believes that friendship relies on willingness to steer those we love away from sin. But Ben never defines what he believes constitutes sin. On page 41, Ben implies that conservatives want to defend free speech and individualism, which is a direct contradiction of his previous definition. What it means to drive someone away from may vary based on ideological, religious, and moral values. If we are to have absolute freedom of individuality, how can we steer others away from sin when their parameters of sin may not match ours? Ben doubles down on this contradiction on page 33 when he says, conservatism believes in the standards of right and wrong, of good and bad. Distinguishing between good and bad requires the exercise of judgment. But what makes Ben's judgment the morally correct one? On page 48, Ben indicates that conservatives and leftists may often have similar goals, even though he said the exact opposite earlier. He says, utopians of the left are generally advocates for anti-conventionalism. They believe that their moral system is the only decent moral system, which ignores that on page 33, Ben had just said that conservatism requires the exercise of judgment, meaning that in both cases, both groups are judging others based on their own definition of a morally correct system. Now, I know I've been kind of hard on Ben so far, so before we delve into more criticism, let's talk about what Ben gets right in this book. First of all, you guys know how I feel about citing my sources, so I gotta give a shout out to Ben for citing his motherfucking sources, dude. He has 33 pages of notes at the end, which made it really great for me to be able to do additional reading on each of the points that he brings up and feel fully researched and informed going into this video. Although I did find it funny each time he cited himself as a source. Now, it was only 6 times out of a 33-page note section, so I'll give it to him. It was just funny, guys. It was just funny. Another premise where I think Ben started to have it right, even though in the end I didn't agree with all of his conclusions, was in his chapter discussing the idea of the new ruling class. He begins this section talking about the Olivia Jade situation. Now, in case you don't remember the whole college bribe scandal, basically what happened was actresses Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman got busted for using their wealth to bribe colleges to admit their children. In the case of Lori Loughlin, most known for being Aunt Becky on Full House, her daughter Olivia Jade was a beauty YouTuber who already had a lot of subscribers and a lot of brand deals, not to mention her parents' wealth. And Ben brings up this example to ask, so why did Olivia Jade even need to go to a good college so badly?
But I do want the experience of like game days, partying. I don't really care about school, as you guys all know.
Why was it so necessary for her to go when she outright stated in the video that she doesn't even care about school or education? Why was it so necessary to the point of her mother using $500,000 and risking jail time to make it happen? In this section, Ben actually said he agrees with Olivia Jade. He agrees that it doesn't make sense for her to care about school in her particular situation. And this leads him to his overall argument about what college has become for many, a place for gaining social status. On pages 74 to 75, Ben says, why in the world did rich, famous parents, millionaires, and billionaires feel the need for their children to go to good schools? The real reason many Americans go to college, particularly Americans who aren't majoring in STEM fields, is either pure credentialism, social cachet, or both. That's because employers typically use diplomas as a substitute for job entrance examinations, and also because college graduates tend to create social capital with other college graduates. On page 76, he continues, damage from degree inflation particularly targets those who disproportionately don't go to college, namely low-income students, many of whom are minority. During economic downturns, those trends are only exacerbated as newly unemployed college graduates crowd out those who don't have college degrees in middle-skill professions. The other advantage of college is access to a new class hierarchy. So let me just take a moment here to say that I agree with a lot of what Ben is saying here. Of course, as he's prone to doing, Ben is later going to completely ruin it with some weird-ass conclusions, but for now, let's talk about what he actually gets correct. College does exacerbate class divisions, especially when it's not accessible to all Americans, and this does lead to some massive problems that Ben and I both agree on. Ben terms this group of elite college graduates the new ruling class. I personally find that term a little dramatic and fear-mongery for my taste, but we'll go with it because he's legitimately onto something here. On page 77, he says, members of the new ruling class are more likely to be married, less likely to engage in single parenthood, less likely to be victimized by crime. They are also more likely to be politically liberal. Charles Murray describes their viewpoint as hollow, meaning that they refuse to promulgate the same social standards they actually practice. There is some truth to this. I mean, look at celebrity activism. Look at billionaires who call themselves liberals or leftists and claim to care about causes that they actually do nothing.
Imagine there's no heaven.
Now, we should note that in this section, Charles Murray, who Ben Shapiro is referencing, is talking specifically about the white American cultural divide in particular. Ben does note that in this book, as white Americans are likely to be politically and socially divided based on whether or not they went to college. And this is true for other racial demographics as well, but in this section, that's the scope of the book that he's referencing. And later in this video, we are going to get into how strange it is that Ben seems to have a lot of opinions consistent with anti-capitalist views, but identifies himself as a capitalist, and what more may be going on there beneath the surface. But for now, section as a frame to talk about some of the legitimate issues that this book addresses. On page 79, Ben points out that college-educated white Americans develop a language of social justice that non-college-educated white Americans don't have access to. There's an accuracy. Many manual workers and blue-collar workers don't have the time to specialize on every single issue, which is why many people characterize low-income white Americans as ignorant. I mean, look at how much time it's taken me to research for this video alone. How much time I've spent researching all of Ben's claims and fully educating myself just to make this review. I did weeks worth of 2 to 3 hour long Twitch streams just to script this video while I pulled up every source and looked into each one and saw where the truth was. If I didn't have the ability to work from home, this wouldn't be possible for me, as it's not possible for a guy working a 12-hour shift in a factory in Ohio. And just to be clear, this isn't to say that people without college education should be exempt from caring about social justice issues. It's just to say that Ben is correct, that the language has developed as a separate dialect among highly educated people. Language evolves based on geographic location and based on closeness to others in your circle. You can't have a conversation outside of your echo chamber if you don't speak the same language. If we look at this from an educational point of view, we would call this concept scaffolding. According to Grand Canyon University, scaffolding is a method in which teachers offer a particular kind of support to students as they learn and develop a new concept or skill. Basically, you have to build on existing knowledge of a certain topic before you can teach about the complexities and nuances of that topic. You can't teach calculus to someone who hasn't learned to count yet. This is important. When I talk to an elderly straight man about LGBTQ issues, if this is someone who doesn't even understand how or why two women might want to marry each other, I'm not gonna immediately go into breaking down the nuances of the discourse about bisexual versus pansexual identities and dialogues. That's not a language that that person would speak yet. Not necessarily because they desire ignorance, but because they, like most of us, have spent their lives in a particular community and particular echo chamber. And I agree with Ben on this point as a whole, and I think it's super important, and it's actually the reason that I'm giving this book 2 stars instead of 1. Based on Amazon's current review stats, I'm gonna be the first 2-star review. Unfortunately, while Ben is correct about this point, he doesn't always practice it effectively himself, evidenced on page 40 of this book. On page 40, where his definition of liberals versus leftists resides, that's not the definition that most people on the left would actually use. He's creating a conservative dialect that differs from a left-leaning dialect, and therefore making discussion between these two groups impossible without a miscommunication. On page 40, he says, "The Democratic Party leadership has shifted from liberal to leftist." This wouldn't be true according to a leftist point of view. If you're speaking leftists' actual language, most hard leftists consider the Democratic Party in the US to be neoliberalism. Many left-leaning Americans would consider Joe Biden to be a somewhat liberal centrist, while they would consider Bernie Sanders to be more of an actual leftist. Either way, the definitions of liberal and leftist that Ben is using in these contexts don't match the way that people who self-describe that way use those words, which causes the conversation to break down into miscommunication. But though Ben got this piece wrong, he does still have a point, particularly in how this relates to the discussion about the dangers of echo chambers. In his introductory chapter, Ben argues, somewhat correctly, that echo chambers are partially responsible for the election of Donald Trump in 2016. On page 28, he mentions that conservative people, when pressured, don't convert, they go underground, which ends up surprising people when a conservative candidate wins. And I found this to be true to an extent. So in 2016, guys, I knew 0 who voted for Trump, And I thought, I've always made it my mission to not have an echo chamber, to have people from various viewpoints in the groups of people that I speak with. But somehow, in 2016, when Trump won, I was blindsided. Even most conservative people I knew voted for a third-party candidate or abstained from voting for president because most of the right-leaning people in my life thought that way for economic policy, but didn't like the way that Trump conducted himself and thought he would look bad for America as a whole. I thought there's no way this guy can win. Even the right-leaning people I know hate him. So when he won, I was shocked. How could he have had tens of millions of people voting for him if I didn't know a single one of them? And that's when I realized that I myself had been part of an echo chamber. I didn't understand what was going on or what the root causes were of how Trump got elected in the first place. So this is all to say that Ben does have a point in a few sections of this book, but overall, I found the book to contain surface level research, which we will now get into. As I'm a writer myself, and this is a book review, I figured the best place to start would be to talk about the language and the writing itself within the book. So first, let's talk a little about sentence structure. It's English teacher time! Your English teacher is back, guys. And today, we are going to be talking about passive participle verbs and sentences with unclear subjects. So the biggest issue with Ben's writing overall is, in my opinion, an intentional one. His frequent use of passive participle verb phrases leads to unclear subjects in his sentence, which causes the reader to project their own demons onto his words. So to start, guys, what is a sentence subject? Most of us probably learned in English class that a sentence has a subject and a verb phrase. That's how we know a sentence is complete rather than being a fragment or just a dependent clause. The subject of a sentence is often the noun phrase. This is the person, thing, or animal that is doing the main verb phrase. If I were to say, I made a mistake, the subject would be I and the verb would be made. This would also indicate that by placing myself as the subject of the sentence, I'm taking responsibility for that mistake. Now, what is a passive participle verb? These are often called past participle verbs or passive voice, but some linguists combine those terms to refer to the specific phenomenon where those two things cross over. In the previous example of the sentence, I made a mistake, made is a past tense verb, and mistake is the object of the verb. A past participle is when you have a verb talking about the past tense of the past tense. For example, if I said, I had made a mistake, that would be an example of a past participle verb phrase. Now, in all of these cases, the verb is active, meaning that I am the one doing the verb. When a sentence is structured like this, meaning subject, verb, object, that is often what we would call active voice. Now, if I were to flip the sentence around to say, a mistake was made, then was made is the passive participle form of that verb phrase. So where is the subject in that sentence? A mistake was made. Is the subject a mistake? If we're using the context of the previous sentence, the subject would still be I, as this is the same sentence. You could phrase it as mistakes were made by me, but many might just leave the sentence alone as mistakes were made, as that does constitute a sentence as well. While I made a mistake keeps the verb active and keeps myself as the subject, a mistake was made eliminates the subject, implying that I do not take responsibility. We don't know who the mistake was made by. While active and passive voice are both technically grammatically correct, they have completely different implications in context. So let's look at some examples of this in Ben's book. On page 27, Ben says, excision of the occasional Trump supporter was insufficient. Exorcism of the very concepts that could lead to the presence of Trump support had to be undertaken. Confessions had to be forced. Purity tests had to be administered. Struggle sessions had to be initiated. So in each of those sentences, the verb phrase is had to be, which is a passive participle form, and each of those sentences has no subject. As a result, the reader has to project who they think this enemy is. Who's the one forcing confessions? Who's the one administering purity tests? The implication here is that this is the left, but that's not one person or one organization, as Ben himself admits in this book. We see this again on page 35. He says, the authoritarian left has artificially shifted Feinberg's balance. Every offense to particularly vulnerable groups, meaning groups defined as vulnerable by the left in a kaleidoscopically changing hierarchy of victimhood, represents the possibility of profound offense. Those who engage in such offense must be silenced. The independent clause of that last sentence doesn't have a subject. Must be silenced is a passive participle verb phrase, meaning Ben is leaving out. Ben is leaving out who is silencing them. Who is enforcing this? In this context, whom are we supposed to fear, Ben? Is it the government? Is it the abstract, non-monolithic concept of the left in general? By leaving it open to interpretation, Ben allows the reader to project who they think this is referring to. Let me know in the comments below who you thought the subject of that sentence was. Let's see if we get some different answers. On page 27, he says, symbols of loyalty would be demanded. Tautology-laden lawn signs plunked into well-manicured grass. Statements of dissociation would have to be undertaken. Dissenters would be lumped in with Trump supporters. So again, we've got a bunch of would be, passive participle verb phrases, lacking of subjects. So who is it that's lumping the dissenters in with the Trump supporters? Who? What person or organization is doing this? Ben, as the author of the book, is responsible for informing me of this. Instead, he leaves these sentences without subjects, causing me to have to project my own interpretation, which could very well be different from someone else's. So let's also look at the language here real quick. He says, well-manicured grass. So he really sneaks in there that those who engage in cancel culture are wealthy leftists, not underprivileged people, which can be true at times, as I referenced in this section about passive celebrity slacktivism.
Make Poe and Finn gay. Make him super gay. Why the fuck not? That's how they come across in this movie. Just do it. There was some interview with J.J. Abrams where he was like doing that like wishy-washy, like I mean, maybe they could be. We're Disney, we're progressive, except not really. We just want to get the illusion. They're so phony.
Is this a new term, passive progressive? It's like a play on passive aggressive. Because remember, what's it, Josh Gad's like minor character?
Beauty and the Beast, yeah, he's a supporting character. He's gay. You see him dancing with a guy in one shot. Look how progressive we are.
So while we're talking about language, I think it's a good time to bring up that Ben has a very weird way of discussing the part of speech known as pronouns. For example, on page 19, he says, every day I receive dozens of letters from people asking me things like, my professor says that anyone who refuses to use preferred pronouns is a bigot. What should I write on my final? I'm afraid he'll grade me down. So before we go into this, what is a pronoun? English teacher still in the house. A pronoun is a word that is used in place of a noun that refers to an antecedent, and the antecedent is usually a noun or noun phrase elsewhere within that sentence or paragraph. Pronouns include words like I, me, you, he, she, it, they, we, us, her, him. Let's count how many pronouns this viewer of Ben's used in the sentence where he wrote to Ben about how he doesn't want to have to use pronouns. What should I write on my final? I'm afraid he will grade me down. What would this email sound like without pronouns? Professor says anyone who refuses to use preferred pronouns is a bigot. What should self write on final? Am afraid Professor Man will decrease grade. Now, let's be fair. This person did say preferred pronouns specifically, so I can assume in good faith that this person is referring to whether to call someone he, she, they, etc. according to what that person says, rather than according to that person's chromosomes or genitals. And honestly, that makes perfect utilitarian sense to me, because how often are we going to see strangers' genitals, let alone their chromosomes? And also, what kind of final exam even is this? Is this student like taking a class on transgender philosophers? And if so, why did the hypothetical student person take this class in the first place? And as we're transitioning out of the language section, this is a perfect place to segue into the next section of this video. Ben Shapiro is just wrong about LGBT people. On page 68, Ben says the following, still regarding pronouns. It remains an unsettled legal question whether failure to use a proper biological pronoun could be considered a violation of federal anti-discrimination law. He includes no source after this, so I don't know which law specifically he's referring to. But since we're moving here from the language section, let's start with the following. What's a biological pronoun? All of my little English students, please type in the chat or the comments below. What's a biological pronoun? What do you think it is? So there's actually no such thing as a biological pronoun. Pronouns are not biological. No part of speech is biological. Language is utilitarian. Language is how we efficiently communicate ideas to another person. The phonemes present in the word she do not have an inherently feminine quality. There is nothing about the sh and then the hard e sound that indicates a vagina. Otherwise, why wouldn't the word for people with vaginas and XX chromosomes be she everywhere? Why would it be ona in Polish and ea in Spanish? And why would her sound different than she? Why would her use the same the H sound as him if H sounds are masculine? Why would the Polish for her be ye instead of ona when those words have 0 sounds in common? Because language does not indicate any inherent qualities about the thing you're discussing outside of the meanings that humans ascribe to them. So as we discussed when I was your English teacher, pronouns refer to antecedents within a sentence or paragraph. So if you said, "This is Savvy, she is making a video right now," what does she indicate? It indicates me. It indicates Savvy. It doesn't necessarily indicate Savvy who has a gaping vagina and sexy XX chromosomes, but we know that Ben knows this. We know that he knows this specifically on page 216 when he says, "The authoritarian left has successfully pursued an educational project, inculcating Americans into embarrassment at America's founding philosophy, her institutions, and her people." If the word her is biological and indicates XX chromosomes and vaginas, please tell me where the United States of America as a country as a whole has XX chromosomes and a vagina. I need you to show them to me. The reason that Ben is making this argument, he's arguing that he likes to refer to everyone with a dick and balls as he and everyone with a vag as she, but other times he says it's based solely on chromosomes. The reason being, he also wants to be rude to trans people who've had bottom surgery too. But is that what pronouns indicate? Do they indicate chromosomes?
There are some scientific and medical contexts where it makes sense to distinguish between transgender and cisgender, or as you say, biological women. For instance, when discussing who needs access to certain reproductive health care you think should be illegal. But does this apply to pronouns? That is, are pronouns technical biological terms denoting karyotypes, or are they part of the everyday language we use to describe each other socially? The answer is obvious. There are no geneticists studying pronouns. In fact, there's not a single biology textbook with a chapter on the difference between a he and a she. There is no such thing as biological pronouns. Human sex chromosomes were discovered in 1905, while the English pronouns he and she originate in the Proto-Germanic language spoken during the pre-Roman Iron Age of Northern Europe beginning around 500 BCE. Therefore, by insisting that the singular third-person pronouns of the English language refer specifically to karyotype, it is you, and not I, who is breaking from linguistic tradition, Ben Shapiro.
So if Ben is anything like his buddy Jordan Peterson, he may make the argument that it's not about wanting to be rude to trans people just for the sake of being a dick. Actually, it's all about free speech. He may deep down just be worried that the government is going to police how he talks in any way, shape, or form. He even said so in the sentence itself. He calls it an unsettled legal question and worries it may violate federal anti-discrimination laws. Well, as Ben provided no source about this, I had to myself look into it to see if there really was any threat of this. So I researched Ben's statement thoroughly and have come to the conclusion that no, freedom of speech still is protecting us against those type of laws that can police how we speak. But let's go a little deeper just to talk about the nuances of the conversation. First of all, as I mentioned, there's no source provided here about which anti-discrimination laws he's referring to, which federal laws include pronouns. And since he didn't mention any specific laws, I had to research this on my own, where I found a couple different things that he might be referencing. So when most people talk about state-mandated pronoun use, they're referring to Jordan Peterson's infamous opposition of the C-16 bill. And since Ben cites no specific bills here or anywhere else in the book that would mandate pronoun use, and based on his long-term professional relationship with Peterson, I imagine that maybe this bill might be part of the concern. And I've covered this bill so many times before, but just because it's relevant here, let's go over it real quick. First of all, the bill only existed in Canada, it never existed in the US, and in a moment I'm going to address US laws as well, but we're talking about this one first. Second of all, C-16 doesn't actually mandate pronoun use. It's not a part of the bill. In the description below, I've linked a legal breakdown of what this bill actually includes, but the word pronoun never once appears in it. The bill basically added gender identity to a list of already protected classes in Canada, which include things like race, religion, etc. The only instance of speech policing, if you can even call it that, mentioned is that it would outlaw speech intended to incite violence against trans people. Inciting violence is already a crime. This bill just made it so that if the violence is incited against trans people, then it would count as a hate crime in the same way it would count as a hate crime if you used racial slurs before advocating for a crime against a person of that race. The bill never mentions the word pronoun. Brenda Kossman, legal professor at the University of Toronto, same place Jordan Peterson taught for a significant portion of his career, said misusing pronouns alone would not constitute a criminal act. But as I mentioned, this bill exists in Canada, not in the US. And the US does specifically have an amendment that guarantees free speech. So, could the US ever have state-mandated pronoun use? Well, first of all, I just like to express my disappointment in Ben for not giving me a source here. Just from my perspective as a reviewer of this book, I think it's his failing as a writer that he didn't provide a specific example of this if he wanted to make a slam dunk position about something as big as freedom of speech being truly threatened. So I looked it up. What does US law say about pronoun use? Almost nothing. The ACLU website includes nothing about using non-preferred pronouns being any type of crime. The LGBTQ discrimination protections listed there include things like not being denied jobs based on LGBTQ status alone, discussions about housing discrimination by landlords, discussions of how to update gender identity on passports and things like that. The site shows absolutely nothing about being able to take legal action against someone for their speech, because we can't do that here. We have freedom of speech, and that includes freedom to be a dick, which means that trans people also have the freedom to call you a dick, Ben. So I looked further. Has there ever been any kind of bill proposed that could violate freedom of speech in regards to gender pronoun usage? After a lot of research as to what Ben could possibly be talking about in the US, I found an article from 2017 breaking down California's Bill 219. So here we are on PolitiFact. Claims mislead about California forcing jail time for using wrong transgender pronoun. Let's look at what happened here. A bill to prevent discrimination of LGBTQ senior citizens in California's long-term care homes is one step from becoming law. It passed the legislature this month and now sits on Governor Jerry Brown's desk. The measure, known as the LGBT Senior Bill of Rights, or Senate Bill 219, would ban facilities from denying admission, transferring, or evicting residents on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, gender expression, or HIV status. Its path through the legislature, however, was marked by an onslaught of misleading critiques from conservative groups starting earlier this year. So let's look at one of those critiques. California bill, 1 year in jail for using wrong transgender pronoun. And if you notice the source, Breitbart, is where Ben Shapiro himself started his career. A new bill being considered by the California State Senate would punish people who willfully and repeatedly refuse to use a transgender resident's preferred name or pronouns in a public health, retirement, or housing institution. The bill, SB 219, was proposed by State Senator Scott Wiener. It includes several other provisions that require a health facility, for example, to honor the gender identity of a patient, meaning that the patient must be admitted to a room that comports with his or her chosen gender, allowed to use whatever bathroom he or she wants to use, and wear whatever clothing or cosmetics he or she decides to wear. Breitbart, I'm not sure if you guys knew this, but it's always been legal for anyone to wear whatever clothing or cosmetics they want to wear. What kind of fascist country do you think we're living in? CBN News reported fines for repeated offenders could be as high as $1,000 and a jail term of up to a year. CBN also reports the testimony of the California Family Council's Greg Burt. How can you believe in free speech but think the government can compel people to use certain pronouns when talking to others? This is not tolerance. This is not love. This is not mutual respect. True tolerance tolerates people with different views. We need to treat each other with respect, but respect is a two-way street. It is not respectful to threaten people with punishment for having sincerely held beliefs that differ from your own. So was Ben right all along? Had I finally found this mysterious bill that was going to limit my free speech at the will of authoritarian California hippies? Nope, but that's what a lot of people thought the bill was saying due to misleading reporting like the one at Breitbart. But before we even get into that, let's talk about what Ben specifically said in the book. He said federal anti-discrimination laws. This law was proposed particularly in California only, within exclusively the scope of senior care homes. I have no idea where he got the federal part from, as I've been able to find no law in other states. According to PolitiFact, Courtney Joslin, UC Davis law professor, said the bar for criminal prosecution would be extremely high. The bill is very, very clear that what is prohibited is the willful engagement and repeated engagement in discriminatory conduct against LGBT LGBT seniors. So if someone makes a mistake or doesn't know what a person's gender identity is and uses the incorrect pronoun, that is not a violation of the statute. Willful and repeated violations alone wouldn't lead to criminal prosecution, Jocelyn said. They would likely be punished with a fine. Criminal charges would only follow, she said, if the violation reached a level that was shown to cause the risk of death or serious physical harm in accordance with the state's existing penalty structure for health and safety code violations at long-term care centers. So harassment laws already exist in California. According to Employment Attorney LA, verbal abuse itself is not unlawful under state or federal laws. However, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act prohibits harassment in the workplace on a discriminatory basis. So let's look at the first sentence of this. Verbal abuse is not unlawful under state or federal laws. So it sounds like free speech is not under any attack on a federal level. Second sentence looks at the scope of it. Harassment in the workplace or in housing. So in this particular bill, 219, elder care homes would be both employment and housing. So the site explains that verbal harassment is illegal in employment and housing based on protected class, which can include using slurs against a particular group. Much like C-16 in Canada, California's 219 seems to add transgender people to the protective groups, not to outlaw any types of speech. But savvy, you might be saying, does this bill provide a gateway to policing speech? Does this bill toe the line a little too close? Well, it's actually for that reason that the bill was ruled unconstitutional in July 2021, 1 month before this book was published. It's being reconsidered as of November 2021 when the California Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments about its reinstating, so as of right now it's still being decided. I wanted to find out the exact status of this law right now. Is it permanently repealed on the basis of free speech violation, or has it been reinstated? So Emily D. Baker, who's a lawyer, found this for me on Twitter, and she sent me the following, and it basically comes down to, it's being deliberated up to the California Supreme Court. Deliberations have been granted more time and will continue into at least February 2022, which, depending on when you're watching this, that's probably either right now or very close to right now. So if all of this has to happen just for one state to potentially include repeated intentional pronoun misuse under already existing harassment law in the workplace alone, then there's no way that the country as a whole is under the threat of losing free speech. Even without this law being repealed, it already seemed to fit in with existing workplace and housing harassment laws in California at the time. So in conclusion, it takes a lot to get a law permanently passed in the US that can limit any type of speech in any way. And even though we do already have certain laws in some places against harassment in the workplace and against inciting violence, verbal harassment itself isn't even outlawed federally. So I'm pretty sure from a legal standpoint, guys, you don't have to worry, free speech is fine. But let's continue with this. Outside of the free speech discussion itself, why does Ben care so much about wanting to call everyone with XY chromosomes a man and everyone with XX chromosomes and also countries a woman? Why is this the hill he wants to die on? Well, according to Ben himself, he believes this approach is the most scientifically accurate one, except with countries, I guess. I disagree, but let's delve into this. So first, let's take a look at how Ben defines science. On page 98, he says, "Science itself is a process of gathering knowledge through painstaking trial and error, through gradual development of a body of knowledge, through observation and data collection, through falsification. Science requires that we believe in objective truths about the world around us, and that we believe in our own capacity to explore the unknown, to uncover those truths. Most of all, science provides the final word where it speaks." I'd say good definition, I agree with that. How Ben has used the concept of scientific truth to bolster his own opinions about the LGBTQ demographic, specifically trans people. On page 112, Ben discusses a Brown University study by Professor Lisa Littman, who is credited with coining the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. The term rapid onset gender dysphoria is not medically recognized, and of this study, Ben says the following. It documented the fact that teenage girls were becoming transgender in coordination with others in their peer group. Brown pulled the study, with Brown School of Public Health Dean Bess writing a public letter denouncing the work for its failure to listen to multiple perspectives and recognize and articulate the limitations of their work. In this section, Ben is using this as an example of how the authoritarian left is infringing on legitimate scientific discovery. If they're going to pull studies just based on leftist principles alone, well, that would be authoritarian. And that's what Ben's implying with the topic sentence of this paragraph, which says, the overt politicization of science is most obvious with regard to gender dysphoria. Ben is arguing that this study was pulled for political reasons, not for scientific ones. But let's look at what Ben actually said. He said the study was pulled, in his words, for its failure to listen to multiple perspectives and to recognize and articulate the limitations of their work. It wasn't pulled for political reasons. It was pulled because the science itself was faulty. Let's talk about why.
In 2016, Brown University public health researcher Lisa Littman began studying the sudden spike in trans identification of teenage girls. She concluded that peer influence and social media influence had a lot to do with this trans teen phenomenon.
If you look at Lisa Littman's study, it may seem sciencey on the surface, and it seems to indicate that there are a large number of quote-unquote girls coming out as transgender without actually being trans. And the study seems to be legitimate. But it's actually really bad research if you look into it. First off, Lightman's study was done not on children, but on parents of transgender youth. And the study was generated by surveying parents on 3 different websites: Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals. Now, for those of you who don't know, all of those sites that I mentioned already had parents on it who were discussing their worry about the sudden onset of becoming transgender. The study was begging the question. It was already going after parents who already thought this way about their transgender kids. Basically, the study is like if you went to a science fiction convention and started asking folks there if they've ever seen Star Trek, and then saying that your results at that convention are indicative of everyone in the world.
Remember, Ben's own definition of science includes a capacity to explore the unknown and discover those truths. Science, according to Ben, has a method. It has a way of determining truth. So, if a study was faulty in its practice, and therefore didn't correctly uncover truth, wouldn't Ben argue that we shouldn't follow that study? So basically, Littman's study was pulled because, just as the dean said, it failed to recognize its own limitations. Those limitations led to inaccurate conclusions, so let's look at some of those. First of all, the studies specifically recruited participants on anti-trans websites. This would be equivalent to me asking all of my leftist friends, do you think Ben Shapiro is wrong about a lot of things? And then coming back and reporting 100% of people think Ben Shapiro is wrong about a lot of things. It's an intentionally biased sample. This is not using science to uncover truth. The study should be updated to include more perspectives, as that will ultimately lead us to gaining a greater understanding of scientific truth. Second of all, the study only interviewed parents of trans teenagers, not the trans teens themselves or their doctors. As I mentioned, the study had a clear bias. By choosing parents from anti-trans forums online, Littman sought out people who actively didn't want their children to be trans, and these people reporting their children being trans must be fake, with disregard for their own potential denial. According to Psych Central, it relies on parental report without independent confirmation and posted recruitment advertising exclusively on anti-trans websites. The websites where participants were recruited to discourage parents and the public alike from accepting or affirming the gender identities of trans people and routinely depict all transgender people as deluded and subject to false belief. This introduces a significant bias, as parents are already encouraged to view their children's identities as false beliefs, and may intentionally or unintentionally misreport certain facts, notably due to recall bias. As previously noted, it is legitimate for studies to include parental reports. However, sole reliance on parental report majorly undermines scientific validity. In the study, parental reports of rapid onset gender dysphoria were uncritically accepted even when contradicted by the child's counselor, therapist, or doctor. So third, let's take a look at the logical fallacies, namely the one we all know about how correlation does not necessarily equal causation. While the study mentioned that many trans-identifying teens also had trans or gender non-conforming friends, that does not necessitate the conclusion that being trans was influenced by their culture or their surroundings. It's just as likely, if not more so, that it happened the other way around, that those friends found each other through having a shared experience. Overall, Littman's study was pulled not for political reasons but for scientific ones that Ben himself says that he agrees with. And this isn't the only instance of Ben weaponizing his own version of science to push an anti-trans agenda. Let's look at another. On page 113, he says, in 2018, the American Medical Association announced that it would oppose any definition of sex based on immutable biological traits identified by or before birth. The AMA even outlined legislation that would ban therapists from suggesting to children that they ought to be more comfortable with their biological sex rather than acting in contravention to it. So first, I went to the source that Ben cited here, the AMA website, and found absolutely no such legislation? The closest thing I could find was a ban on conversion therapy, which is already scientifically known to be abusive to children and not scientifically sound. I found no such legislation that would ban therapists from suggesting a child become comfortable with their birth sex if that is truly what's best for that patient. Notice the manipulative writing in this section too, specifically around the word rather. Ben is setting up a false dichotomy here. He's claiming that therapists have only two options: to either get kids transitioning or to convince kids that they should be comfortable with their birth gender. What Ben is completely neglecting here is that therapy is individualized. It depends on the specific situation. What Ben may be referring here to is something that Jordan Peterson actually quote tweeted from the UK station GB News.
The NHS already mandates that anybody who questions their sex should be automatically affirmed and encouraged to begin the pathway to transition rather than undergo counselling to explore the psychological landscape and seek to reverse it. But if this becomes enshrined in law, any therapist who wishes to assist a patient with counselling to treat their dysphoria with the end goal of being at ease with their sex at birth could be accused of committing a crime.
Listen to the anchor's language there specifically. She doesn't say therapy with the goal to find out your true identity and live the best, healthiest possible life, whether that ends up being gender transition or comfort with your birth sex. She specifically mentioned therapy with the goal of comfort in your birth gender. The problem here isn't that some fraction of patients who visit a therapist might not really be trans. The problem is that she, Peterson, and Shapiro have decided preemptively that the goal of therapy should be comfort with your birth gender, when in reality, the goal of therapy should be driven by each client's individual needs and specific circumstances. A tweet from Dr. Stephen Hassan, who is a cult expert. He's the creator of the cult bite model that we often talk about in many videos dissecting multi-level marketing companies on this channel. He recently tweeted saying the exact opposite of what Jordan Peterson and GB News said. He said, therapists should help clients make decisions and choices for themselves and ones in their best interest, not tell them what they should or shouldn't do. Basically, if a therapist enters a session with a bias or a predetermined goal in mind, that will hinder that patient's individual progress, especially if physical transition does end up being the right option for that individual. Once trans people enter the conversation, Ben's usual tactic is to ask his opponent for a clear definition of what a woman is, without any reflexivity, meaning you can't define being a woman as just being a woman.
Men and women are a completely different thing. This is true. Have you ever met a man or a woman?
For me, it kind of goes down to, for instance, if someone were to adopt children, there's no biological basis for calling them that kid's parents, because they're not. Like, they're just literally not. There's no link at all biologically, but there is a social reason to do it and there's a legal reason to do it. So for me, that's sort of where it boils down to me with pronouns.
What qualities do all women share? What is something that every woman must have to make them a woman? Here's the thing, guys. This might be a little disappointing, and if you're one of Ben's fans watching this, I need you to just stick with me for a second, okay? Because I'm going somewhere with this. There is no such, and it's not that there's just no such quality that all women share that denotes womanhood, it's that there's no such quality that anything in any category shares, because language has human limitations. Here's an example. How do I know that this thing I'm reviewing right now, The Authoritarian Moment by Ben Shapiro, how do I know that this is a book? What qualities and properties that all books share does this book have that makes it a book? So you could look at this a few ways. You might say, well, it's obviously because it's bound together with pages in the middle and a front and a back cover and a spine. This would be a structural definition of a book. A lot of books might fall into this category, from fiction to nonfiction to poetry, or books without words, including coffee table books consisting exclusively of photography, or a sketchbook consisting exclusively of blank pages. So here's the next question. If Ben had released this, The Authoritarian Moment, exclusively on Kindle, would it still be a book? What if he released it only as an audiobook and it was all the exact same content? How do we know it would be a book and not a podcast? What if it was the exact same content but in a different structure? If the text is presented digitally like in an ebook or auditorially like in an audiobook, is this content still a book? I'd say yes, the content's identical, so obviously it's still a book. But then it loses the structural element. So maybe structure isn't how we define a book. Maybe books are defined by content. A book must contain contain words, it must contain text, it must contain a story or information. But then let's look at a blank sketchbook. That's also a book. It has book in the name, ebook, audiobook, sketchbook, hardcover book. They all include the name book. And as Ben says himself about the Boy Scouts, if the name is in the thing, it indicates what the thing is.
I'm saying that the Boy Scouts have a standard. You must be a biological boy to be a Boy Scout. You have to be a boy to be a Boy Scout. In the name Boy Scouts.
So by that logic, the commonly used names of these items would suggest that they're all books. A blank sketchbook and Ben's book in audio form share zero qualities in structure or in content. A butch lesbian powerlifter on steroids and a hyper-feminine pre-op trans woman share zero qualities in biology or in social presentation, but they're both women. And how do we know that? I don't know, I just try to take people at their word for what they say and assume people aren't trying to manipulate and deceive me all the time, because that's a horrible way to live your life. I don't know if what I'm reading right now is a book either. That is to say, the limits of language are human constructed and don't hold objective truths in the way that science does. This book means something different to me than my sketchbook means to me. Both of those mean different things to me than an audiobook I have of slam poetry means to me. Similarly, womanhood, being a woman, is defined differently by every woman you ask. It means different things to each woman. For some women, it's about giving birth and becoming a mother. It's not that for me. For some women, it's about having more estrogen. For some, it's about having a vagina and fighting for rights related to having a vagina. And for some women, it's about being called she, and it's about being perceived socially as a woman. No two women are going to have the same definition, regardless of if they're trans or not. So Ben, I'll gladly define woman for you when you define book for me. Ben ends his section about trans people with the sentence, "Scientific inquiry is forbidden." Once again, note Ben's use of passive participle verb phrases and his lack of a clear sentence subject. Who forbids it? Not the government, as we clearly dissected each of the examples he gives that would indicate some kind of government authoritarianism. Is it the scientific community itself? Well, Ben himself said the goal of the scientific community is to uphold scientific standards. And as we saw in the Brown study, Littman's methods were scientifically incomplete. So who is forbidding this? I don't know. And Ben, as the author of this book, doesn't tell me. So language can limit what we say, and that's also influenced by the language you speak and the culture you're from, the time in history when you're speaking, and how the words you're speaking have evolved or exist in context. So talking about these things in super literal definitions isn't going to be helpful in the long run. What matters is our actions. What matters is how we treat one another. Let's look at how Ben believes people in the LGBT community should be treated. Let's see his words in action. On page 68, Ben says, "Anti-discrimination law has been radically extended to include everything from transgender identification to same-sex marriage, clashing dramatically with freedom of association and freedom of religion." Here, the laws that Ben is referring to are those that claim that employers can't discriminate in hiring based on LGBTQ status, including being trans or being in a same-gender relationship or marriage, and Ben claims that these laws violate freedom of association, meaning that any employer or any person should have the right to choose whom they associate with in any given context. If Ben wants to refuse people jobs because they're trans, he wants that to be his right under a free market system. So keep this position in mind as we move into the next section. Is Ben Shapiro secretly an anti-capitalist? Remember that earlier in this book, one of Ben's arguments against having to tolerate having LGBTQ people in his same place of work is the argument that all Americans have freedom of association, meaning that we don't have to spend any amount of time around any person we don't want to. From there, it would follow that Ben would support at-will employment, meaning that an employer can hire or fire someone for any reason, and an employee can take a job or quit a job for any reason, which does go along with his belief in a completely free market system. But let's revisit this from the thesis of Ben's book as a whole. Remember, back on page 20, he defined authoritarian as free speech and free exchange of ideas die when the philosophical tolerance withers. Government authoritarianism isn't the only way to kill American freedom. Cultural authoritarianism works too. It has always worked. Remember, he distinguished cultural authoritarianism because Ben does believe in a free market system. Remember also what he said on page 21. There's no respite. Your employer requires your fealty to woke principles. Corporations require that you mirror their political priorities. The media treat you as a cruel barbarian. And then remember when he distinguished cultural authoritarianism from government authoritarianism, also on page 21, when he said, after all, it's just the free market working. Why are you whining about social media censorship or about social ostracism? People have a right to tear you to shreds, to end your career, to malign your character. It's all free speech. So when we take all of these statements into account, here's the problem. I don't see how Ben's desire for complete freedom of association, including in the workplace, can coexist along with protection against the authoritarian left. Like we talked about earlier in this video, the guarantee of one freedom will often lead to the destruction of another. It's up to the humans that participate in a particular society to determine which freedoms are the most important to protect when those paradoxes do come into play. So on page 119, Ben begins a chapter all about this, which is titled Your Authoritarian Boss. The chapter begins with an anecdote about a fan who emailed him in distress. According to the book, she worked at a Fortune 50 company that had quotas on who they want to hire and put into a position of leadership based solely on skin color. At a company meeting, this fan voiced her opinion that the company should not support programs rooted in racial composition. All 5 of the participants in the meeting immediately called my manager, she related. My manager asked if I was still a good fit, and I came close to losing my job. Ben then continues, whenever we open the phone lines on my radio show, the board fills with employees concerned that mere expression of dissent will cost them their livelihood. But this here is a direct contradiction to what Ben said on page 68, when, remember, he said, anti-discrimination law has been radically extended to include everything from transgender identification to same-sex marriage, clashing dramatically with freedom of association and freedom of religion. If freedom of association is important to Ben, why wouldn't he support that manager threatening his fan's job? If that particular manager wants to associate only with those who believe in affirmative action or who value diversity in the workplace, that should be that manager's right. Right? That would be that manager's freedom of association. So why does freedom of association only matter when it's about Ben not wanting anti-discrimination laws, but whenever someone uses it in a way that he doesn't like, suddenly that's authoritarianism? Now, like much of the book, his chapter on Your Authoritarian Boss doesn't get everything wrong. In fact, I thought he raised some really important talking points. So let's talk about it on page 122 when Ben says, to be clear, none of these corporations, all beneficiaries of a free market in hiring, firing, and customer base, actually believe that America is systemically racist in the same way the authoritarian leftists mean. These corporations merely mirror what Americans think. Corporations, then, merely do what they do in order to make money. As always. I maybe wouldn't have phrased it the way he does because I probably wouldn't use the phrase authoritarian left. However, I do see what he's getting at, and I'm glad he called out the hypocrisy of corporations who often do this performative type of activism as a marketing tactic as opposed to actually believing in these things. Hey y'all, Editing Savvy here. You may be noticing in this review that Ben Shapiro's been saying some racist shit and we haven't really been going into it. That's because we're going to be covering that in part 2 of this video, which is going to come out in a couple weeks when we're going to discuss Ben's portrayal of the media and journalism and things like that. This video is already getting so long that I don't think I can fully delve into all the racist shit he says and do it justice in this video, so stay tuned. In a couple weeks, part 2 is gonna come out and we're gonna go into all of that as well as a bunch of other stuff like fake news and all that. He continues, there's something undeniably ironic about corporations pretending to support a worldview that sees their very presence as evil, here referring to how if corporations pander to primarily leftist modes of thinking, they're ultimately trying to make their customer base a group of anti-capitalists, which would love to see all of the big corporations' demise. And I agree here, I think that is kind of weird. But again, it ties in with the whole performative thing that corporations do just for the sake of making money. I don't trust corporations. I'm glad Ben doesn't either. On page 123, he says, failure to abide by increasing political diktats of the corporate overlords may risk your job. And here I wondered, is Ben anti-corporation? Because if so, that's great. That's some common ground that we have. Can Ben and I agree that regardless of the end result we'd like to see in terms of equality of opportunity in the world, that corporate control itself is a major problem. It's a hurdle to all of us. So I wanted to say that I completely agree with Ben about what the root of this problem is, and that is big companies having too much influence on the way things run. My question that follows, though, since Ben is the one writing this book, and I paid for this book to learn things, not just to listen to him complain, which I can do on YouTube for free, what does his perfect free market system look like? I wish he'd proposed some sort of model that would solve these problems, or at the very least guarantee more freedoms for all workers. On page 126, Ben compares the workplaces of today to the workplaces of decades past. He says, conservatives and liberals alike used to fret about the enforced conformity of corporate life, but corporations have now discovered the magic of quaffing from the well of wokeism. By following the diktats of political correctness in hiring, they can escape censure for corporate culture. However, he does contradict this point directly on page 127, which is the very next page, when he says, where old-style bosses used to tell quarrelsome, peacocking employees to sit down at their desks or find themselves standing on the breadlines, today's bosses seek to comply with every woke demand, up to and including days off for mental health during political fraught times. But these are two sides of the same coin. He's comparing bosses that demand compliance in decades past to bosses that demand compliance today. Even though the bosses are demanding compliance in a different way, it's still the bosses having complete control over the workers. Was the first type, where you have to stay silent or find yourself on the breadline, was that preferable to Ben? I'm confused what system he's actually advocating for here. But of course, on page 130, Ben brings it all together by simping for capitalism once again. He says, capitalism creates wealth and prosperity for all because it is rooted in fundamental truth. Your labor belongs to you, and you have no right to demand the products of my labor without giving me something I want in return. So I do agree that this is a better system than corporate bailouts and things like that, which, based on stuff Ben has said in this book, I think he would probably agree are a problem as well. But I would wonder how far Ben takes this principle of nobody being entitled to anyone else's labor. I know that Ben has never been a vocal supporter of universal health care, to say the least, but what about public education? Does he think public education's bad too? What does he think about public roads? Does he think every public service is bad because we have to pay for it in taxes, and that means the government is allocating money we got from our own labor in ways we didn't consent to? Would he take it that far? I don't know. Honestly, I feel that a solution to this could be universal basic income, and I've said this before. If everyone's allocated an amount of money, that can inspire more innovation and more entrepreneurship, which would breed more free market activity. Especially because in order for capitalism to actually work, everyone has to have some level of capital in the first place. The system we currently have doesn't allow for everyone to be guaranteed capital. Instead, our current version of capitalism we have is not a free market at all. It's a market where, due to circumstances outside people's control, it tells you that without financial value, without providing financial value to the world, you don't deserve to live. And tying someone's inherent human value to their financial value, I personally see as morally wrong. But once again, Ben and I may have different moral systems, and that's partially why pieces of this book may not make sense without Ben clearly defining what he thinks the overall best moral system for all is. And while I don't agree that a capitalist system is necessarily a good system, I prefer a more mixed economy, especially one with some guaranteed healthcare. I can see the benefits of having a mostly free market. However, Ben himself contradicts even this point on page 133, when he complains to us, when the Goya CEO appeared at a Trump White House event to tout his work during the pandemic, leftists began a nationwide boycott. Something similar happened when LGBT activists targeted Chick-fil-A over their founder's support for traditional marriage. But isn't this the free market? Isn't the entire philosophy behind the free market that you vote with your dollar? Ben presents these events in the book as if they're bad things, but in any purely free market system, that's how the system is intended to work. The same thing happened on the opposite side when conservatives boycotted Nike after Nike showed support for Colin Kaepernick. If someone dislikes what a brand stands for, outside of authoritarian government intervention, a boycott is the most free market and capitalist way to go about having your voice heard. So what was Ben's issue with that? Ben gets to his overall solution on page 137. He says, anti-discrimination law in most states bars discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, race, medical disability, marital status, gender expression, age, and a variety of other categories. but there is not anti-discrimination protection for politics. So I've got a few questions here. First, how would an anti-discrimination protection against politics even work? Would it relate to what party you're registered with? Like a boss isn't allowed to ask you about your party affiliation before they hire you or fire you or whatever? Or would it be about like your beliefs in general? And how can you protect the abstract concept of beliefs? In your own examples in this book, you discuss people having their jobs threatened or being fired for stating out loud beliefs that the boss disagrees with. So would this protection then ensure that anyone can say anything at work without any repercussion? That's the rule now? So is the idea that if you go around work yelling loudly about how much you hate gay people all day, that's protected under your right? You can go around like shit-talking your coworkers all day long and that's work freedom of speech is now protected? What makes a belief even political or not? How would you draw the line to where a belief is political versus whether a belief is moral versus whether a belief is religious? Is this specifically about beliefs related to policy? Or is this about every belief that could possibly exist under the sun? And then this is the question that I have most of all for Ben. If Ben is coming at this with a free market approach, how does more government intervention and more government regulation solve anything from his own perspective? Shouldn't he be supporting people boycotting Chick-fil-A rather than the government coming in with additional regulations to protect political expression? I'm just really unsure what his end game is here. And because, again, this isn't a political video, this is a book review. My review of this section of the book is that Ben did not sufficiently convince me of what the particular problem is and how it can be solved without him becoming an anti-capitalist himself. However, I do want to point out that I really do appreciate Ben's support for small businesses in this book, genuinely. Everyone knows that this channel's all about supporting each other in our business ventures, and I do think he makes a good point about the dangers of big corporations taking over. At page 138, which in my opinion is the best overall page of this book, I even wrote on it that this is the best page of this book, he says, "The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the advantages for large companies. Between March 2020 and September 2020, more than 400,000 small businesses closed. Meanwhile, big companies got bigger. As economist Austin Goolsbee wrote in the New York Times, big companies are starting to swallow the world." Ben presents this large company takeover as a negative. Now, for him, the negative comes from how he's seeing these big companies are pandering to what he calls woke leftist authoritarian principles. And while that's not what I think the actual issue here is, I do agree that big companies taking over at its core is terrible. Because regardless of someone's political leaning, the ability for them to start new ventures and work within their communities and breed innovation, that's a good thing. And I'm also scared of big companies gaining too much power. Because regardless of which side you're on, when a big company controls too much, they can flip their ideals on a dime. As Ben has said in this book, and as I agree with, the nature of the mainstream acceptance of free market individualism versus social collectivism and the mainstream acceptance of those ideas in the US has been very cyclical over time for the past few decades. The social issues people care about most also change over time. If conservative viewpoints were to become super mainstream in media, will it suddenly become cool for corporations to promote the opposite of what they promote now? Probably, because at the end of the day, they are trying to make money. Either way, big bosses shouldn't be the ones deciding these things. The people should. So how do we get out of this mess? Well, I went to look at the New York Times article that Ben cited earlier, the one regarding economist Austin Goolsbee, and that article actually says, "What's needed to prevent rich companies from engaging in a mass gobbling up of small competitors is for government antitrust authorities to become more muscular." So in this case, some level of government intervention may be needed to keep the free market thriving in the first place. And that's the real problem we're starting to see on social media. Ben loves to complain in this book and on his show about conservative influencers having their content deleted from Twitter or being demonetized on YouTube, but that's not authoritarianism. That's corporate control. It's too few tech companies controlling too much of the market. And that's what we're going to be talking about in part 2 of this video, which is going to come next week. There is still so much more to unpack in this book. Ben's thesis in this book posits that authoritarian leftists have taken over the media, meaning journalism, entertainment, online content creation, and more. But is this true? Do Ben's facts support his conclusions? We'll have to wait to find out next week on Dragon Ball Z. Thank you so much to everyone who watched this video. Thank you again so much to my sponsor, Magic Spoon, for sponsoring this video and supporting this channel. And thank you again to all my Patreon supporters. I will see you guys Monday morning on the next episode of Your Morning Guru on the second channel. Make sure you're subscribed there. And I will see you guys here next Friday on this channel for part 2 of this video. But in the meantime, Ben Shapiro and I would both agree on this. Please don't forget to support small businesses. Happy Friday!